Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, Virtual Cards, Secure, Faster Payments That Pay You Back, co-hosted by our partner, CSI. Before we actually kick off the session, I've got a couple of housekeeping items for you. So first of all, we will have time for questions after the session. So if you have a question as we're going through the presentation, you can always type your question into the GoToWebinar console where it says questions, and we'll address it at the end. And afterwards, if you'd like to rewatch or share the session, you're actually in luck because we will email the link to the replay of this session to you likely tomorrow. So just keep an eye out for it in your inbox. And now, Chris Dinkler, our Senior Vice President of the Business Automation Group at Enverus, would like to say a few words to you about the new payment solution we're discussing today. So Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Susie, and thanks everybody for joining on this webinar regarding our payment solution and our partnership with Corporate Spending Innovations. We're super excited to bring this to market. I'll just have a few words, and then I'll be turning it over to Eric Riddle, who is the Senior Vice President and actually Executive Vice President for Corporate Spending Innovations. And so last year, our customers had asked us, we just had a lot of customers ask us about payment solutions and providing a more robust offering that was integrated into OpenInvoice. As many of you know, we have over 50,000 suppliers using our network, and we have over 400 E&P companies using it, and everybody was trying to get more efficient with that. So we went to market, we looked for a partner, we talked to some banks, we talked to a lot of fintechs, we probably talked to over 10 potential providers and partners that do this. And what some of you don't know is we already do print mail for AP checks, and we already had provided that service, and we do that for customers such as Marathon and others, but we wanted to expand that offering to an integrated ACH and virtual card offering. And so today we're going to be focused on virtual cards, but I just wanted to say a few words about why we selected Corporate Spending Innovations. We were looking for a partner who could be nimble and who could also very well backed, had the technology wherewithal, and really and integrated with multiple solutions. Corporate Spending Innovations fit those criteria. We did a very thorough RFP, and what we found was Corporate Spending Innovations, we worked with Visa and MasterCard. They also had the technology backing. They're backed by Edenred. Edenred, if you don't know, is one of the largest payment solutions in the world. And so they brought a lot of expertise to the market. And then what we found was they integrated super well with our supplier onboarding team. And so those of you have probably already have experience working with our supplier onboarding team. And so we found our ability to be able to bring to market a solution that allowed customers to see results. We heard from customers that they've tried virtual card, they maybe didn't get the results that they wanted. And what we found was that was typically because some of the solutions that they were using, whether it be a bank or another solution, weren't as adept at supplier onboarding and retention. And with our team, with our supplier onboarding team, with our supplier portal, matched with Corporate Spending Innovations focus on working with suppliers, onboarding suppliers, it was a really great match. And so super pleased with the partnership thus far. Number of customers that have engaged us already. And so hopefully you'll learn a little bit here. And if you like what you see, talk to your account director, and they'll be happy to talk to you a little bit more about that. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce a friend now and colleague, Eric Riddle, Executive Vice President for Corporate Spending Innovations.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate that introduction. I hadn't thought until now how difficult it was going to be to follow your voice. You've got that voice and a face, of course, for radio. So I really appreciate the introduction and look forward to working with you. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining today. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you about what we do at CSI and also about the market in general. We'll keep this highly educational. So I think you'll enjoy the agenda we have put together for you today. Just a little blurb on myself. I've been in the procure-to-pay space for about 20 years. My gray hair shows that I did some things prior to that, but for the last 20, have been in procure-to-pay specifically within the technology space. First 10 years of that 20 was in procurement, so I was part of the original automation of the procurement process with e-procurement solutions, sort of automating workflow. Spent some time with a few different technology providers there, progressed into sourcing, into contract management, and then for the last now 11 years, I've been in the financial side of the procure-to-pay spectrum, ultimately spending the last year with CSI on the last mile of payment delivery, specifically with all payment types. So feel like I've had a chance to see and follow the automation path of the procure-to-pay spectrum, and it's been a really interesting place to be. And I'm no less excited about this last mile as I was on the first mile back in 1999 when I jumped into it. So looking forward to the next several years and the continued innovation as technology continues to automate and streamline process. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the world as it's changed. Obviously, we're in a very unique situation with working from remote locations, working from home. It's really, I think, had multiple types of impact on business, on personal relationships, as we can all feel and sense. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about how payments are impacted specifically as a result of that condition that we're working through and dealing with. We'll make an attempt to identify the market opportunity. So why do payment companies like CSI exist? Why does Enverus have an interest in bringing this value proposition to you, their customer and prospect base? We'll talk a little bit about the solution. What is it? How does it work? What is a virtual card? What are its attributes? Why do suppliers like it or dislike it? We'll talk a little bit about some of the specific program design and program implementation elements, maybe try and give you some food for thought as to why, if you've tried this in the past, it may not have worked or has not worked to your satisfaction. So we've got a really clear view on what it takes to be successful in architecting dramatic results for a payment program. And then finally, we'll talk about what it takes to get started, and we'll handle some Q&A if there are any. So let's jump into the moving forward. Just a little bit about CSI. Chris alluded to it. We are a company that's been around for quite some time. We've been in business for nearly 30 years. We are operated and regulated similar to a bank in the sense that we are PCI compliant. We operate within procurement card standards. We are SOC 1 and SOC 2 Type 2 compliant. We are HIPAA compliant. So we are very careful and tightly controlled as it relates to legal, technical, and operational requirements associated with those regulations. We've got several U.S. banks that use and leverage our technology as white label providers into the market. And we are very uniquely certified as both a MasterCard and Visa issuer. So we can issue both Visa and MasterCard, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a moment. As Chris also mentioned, we are a wholly owned subsidiary of Edenred. Edenred is a publicly traded leader in transaction processing, mainly payments. They're really a giant fintech, about $2 billion in overall revenues. So we are not venture-backed or privately funded. We went through that transaction sometime last year. And then finally, we've got over 11,000 corporate customers, about 3,500 integrated payment programs, similar to what we're talking about today. We've got some very large customers that operate in excess of $1 billion per year on card. So processing card payments in excess of $1 billion per year. Pretty significant. So talking a little bit about the world that we're in today, I mean, it's just so unusual. It's changed things in so many ways. I can see many positive influences that these changes have made into my life personally. Hopefully you can see some of the positives as well. But the reality is it's forced us to have to do business in a different way. It's having us forced to do business in a distributed environment. And if you're of an organization, as an example, that is still printing, mailing, and distributing checks yourselves, you realize that someone may need to go into the office either at night or when traffic slows down or under some circumstances and actually handle that aspect of your accounts payable. But as we say, this too shall pass, but in the interim, we really need to think about how we're going to do things differently. So it's really forcing us to look at changing payment processes, things that we can do differently, operating in a distributed environment, as I mentioned earlier. How do we process formally check paid vendors, given the security challenges of this distributed environment? Are there things that we can overcome, things that we should be talking about in order to bring some semblance of order to that situation? So that's sort of the backdrop of what we're dealing with, and we'll make sure to weave that in as we talk about the solution going forward. So I'd like to start first with defining the market opportunity as follows. I would focus your attention to the right side of the screen under the B2B heading. In the US, and this is outside of energy and oil and gas, but essentially the total B2B payment volumes between buyer and sellers tops $120 trillion per year globally. In the US, that number is $25 trillion alone. And what's important for us to consider on this conversation is that 4% of that is currently automated by virtual card payment or credit card payment. 36% of that 25 trillion is automated in some other digitized form of payment, leaving 64% of that volume of $25 trillion in the US alone that's still done manually via check or cash. So great opportunity relative to the rest of the world, which is far more automated. If you've operated in Europe, the concept of a B2B check outside of the US is an extremely foreign concept, no pun intended. So it just doesn't exist. So we've got to get with the times. I think our situation now is forcing a lot of attention on this matter, as is the efficiency opportunity and the opportunity to generate new income streams that the rest of the world has been aware of for some time. So how do we quantify that? In the US, against that $25 trillion in B2B payment volume, companies spend about $26 billion a year simply issuing and depositing checks. These are processing costs associated with the creation and the receipt and the reconciliation process associated with making payments today. Additionally, in the US, even though we have that level of inefficiency that's costing $26 billion to US companies, we've also got more than 1 million checks per day forged in the US. And that impact, financial impact, totals $18.7 billion. So in this Wall Street Journal survey, 75% of companies that had experienced that check fraud had reported an adverse financial impact, which again totals up to $18.7 billion. So here you have almost $45 billion a year in fraud and unnecessary, as we see it, unnecessary processing costs associated with making payments in an antiquated and inefficient way. So pretty significant driver in terms of activity associated with moving payments from manual paper-based forms to digitized forms. And frankly, this doesn't include another $50 billion opportunity for U.S. companies associated with new income streams. And that's going to come from rebates. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So how fast and at what pace is the market moving away from manual forms of payment? And I would focus your attention here to the lower section of the slide, where on the left, you've got the current distribution of payment type. 64%, as discussed earlier, is still done by a cash or check. 32% is done by ACH, normal, straightforward ACH, and 4% by a virtual card, per the survey we mentioned earlier. But if you fast forward 3 to 5 years from now, which is not a long time in the way things develop, you can see a migration, a dramatic migration over to more digitized, efficient forms of payment. I'll call your attention to the reduction in check volume, cash and check volume from 64 to 40. And where has that 24% of the 25 trillion in volume gone? Well, a portion of it, 8% of it, has gone to ACH, which is interesting and efficient for the buyer, but perhaps not so efficient for the supplier. When you as a buyer issue a payment via ACH to your supplier, it typically arrives in just a single lump sum payment to their designated bank account and doesn't necessarily have the ability to accommodate reconciliation detail. So there's still some processing work required on the AR side at your supplier's location. Virtual card has increased by 6%, up to 10% from 4%, which is great to see because that means companies will be taking advantage of rebate opportunity and income streams associated with paying via virtual card. And then there's a new entrance of what's called enhanced ACH. These are private network payments that are electronic in nature, similar to an ACH payment, but also include some data, a data file, or they're also called a data-rich payment. So the payment comes with reconciliation detail so that the supplier has a more efficient reconciliation process. So it's a pretty rapid transition. It's happening quickly, motivated by that $45 billion in fraud and inefficiency, as well as the income opportunity associated with rebate on virtual cards as a form of payment. So what is the lift? What does the lift look like to make that migration to an electronic form of payment? This was a really interesting study that I found hit close to home for me because of my exposure to this procure-to-pay process, especially from a technology perspective. Of all the big rocks, if you will, or the big components of the procure-to-pay spectrum, payment processing, if I can direct your attention over to the very right, was the most automatable section of the procure-to-pay spectrum as opposed to any other. So the way I look at this is the payment process is mostly, if not completely automatable, with relatively light lift from a manual perspective. So a lot of this inefficiency and this expense and fraud risk and that can be automated, which is one of the most effectively automated pieces of the overall procure-to-pay. So relatively light lift with significant impact. So now we'll transition and talk a little bit about the solution itself. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on process and technology on today's call. This is really just educating you on the business condition that we'd like you to think about. But essentially, the world becomes as follows. Via either an integration with your ERP system or OpenInvoice, you'll send a payment file. So essentially, which vendors are being paid, what's the maturing due date, how much are you paying them, and by vendor code, vendor recognition, we can assess and direct the payment in any of 3 payment forms that have been designated. Either virtual card, if the vendor is accepting of virtual cards, ACH, if that's the preferred method of payment delivery or payment receipt for that matter, and then finally, as a last resort, check. So again, we have the ability to automate the optimization process of how vendors are paid so as to either optimize income or optimize lowest cost. So it's a fairly streamlined process. You can have a second set of workflows in there. So if you're used to managing managing cash flow by deciding when to drop a check into the mail, or you'd like to have 2 or 3 authorities view payments before they're received, we can automate that process as a part of our platform. So you can do it in the ERP, you can do it in the invoice automation platform, OpenInvoice if you'd like, or you can do it via the CSI platform. On the other end of the spectrum, you never even have to log into CSI. You can have it all happen in an automated way, but those rules and that setup is determined at the point of the program design and program implementation. So at a high level, send us a payment file, we'll process it, and then we'll distribute payment to the suppliers according to the payment type that's designated. Pretty straightforward process. So let's talk a little bit about virtual cards themselves. In case you were unaware, virtual cards are essentially the same as a debit or credit card issued by an issuer such as CSI, but distributed via the MasterCard or Visa networks. And they are typically single-use in nature, so they're virtual, they're used once, and the number expires, the card expires. They can be and are typically restricted by merchant category codes, so that MCC is merchant category code, meaning that the card has to match a process that identifies the receiver as a merchant within the category that the card was designated to be sent to. They typically do have an expiration date. It's typically much shorter term, not like when you receive a new Visa or MasterCard in the mail that's good for the next 4 years. These are typically good for 30 to 45 days or less. And they finally are typically issued and designated with a specific amount relative to the statement that's being paid and the invoice sum that's being paid. So similar to a check, but virtual, completely virtual in nature, much more secure, much safer, and very controllable, as we'll talk about in a moment. So you might be thinking, don't suppliers pay a fee to accept a credit card as a form of payment? Well, the fact is that yes, they do, but we'll talk in a moment about the offsetting value proposition. The first thing I'd like to point out before we get there, though, is that there is a difference between buyers' perception of the supplier's willingness to accept a card versus the supplier's reality. This is something that CSI has become expert at. We really understand the supplier community, the supplier emotion. We've done surveys. We understand why suppliers accept or don't accept. We understand how to position with a supplier to maximize acceptance. So there's a lot of science and art behind this. But in this study that was done some time ago, there's a recent study that showed something very similar to this. So we're still using this depiction. Buyers perceive that they have a relatively low degree of control over acceptance. 63% of buyers surveyed suggested that they didn't have much control over whether or not a supplier accepted a virtual card as a method of payment. That said, the likelihood that most suppliers said that they accept the card is 82%, said that yes, they would accept the card if their buyer asked them to. So the reality is, this isn't something necessarily that we're fighting. This is not the battle we fight. We will introduce virtual card to suppliers that have already made the decision to accept it. So when we implement these programs, we aren't signing up suppliers, generally speaking, to take a virtual card for the first time. We're usually leveraging the fact that they've already made that business decision for themselves. So it's important to recognize that, yes, there is a fee to the supplier, but there's offsetting value. So what does that value look like? From a buyer's perspective, typically to be able to automate payment away from check and away from manual forms of payment, there are lower processing costs on the buyer's side. This was identified as part of that $26 billion per year. Usually there's new cash flow associated with this because when the vendor chooses to accept a virtual card as a method of payment, it creates an interchange fee, and the interchange fee is then distributed, a portion of which is distributed back to the buyers and becomes new net income stream or new cash flow streams. Paying suppliers in this way offers a relatively easy vendor onboarding experience. KYC process, payment receiving process is predetermined when a supplier is accepting the card network. So there's no bank account setup and that sort of thing. It's been done already as a result of them joining the networks. And finally, there's a more secure disbursement from the buyer initiation side with reduced exposure, check fraud specifically, that lowers that $18.7 billion we talked about earlier. So what about the vendor side? Why does the vendor choose to accept virtual card as a form of payment? Well, the payment can be received faster and settled faster in their bank account faster. In some cases, 8 to 10 days. If you consider a check mailing time, check processing time, bank holding times, some suppliers say that virtual card, which is virtually settled instantaneously, or at least next business day, depending on their relationship with the merchant bank that brought them onto the network, they can reduce their DSO from your payments by as much as 8 days, which can be significant depending on the cash flow scenario for the supplier. Clearly, the payment is more secure. It's digitized. There's reduced exposure to fraud. It can't be intercepted in the mail. It can't be forged. So far more secure form of payment. Probably most significantly for high volume suppliers that are receiving payment via card versus check or other forms is the fact that we can include detailed remittance information along with the payment. In some cases, we can even automate the actual GL posting with a straight-through processing relationship, which will post the payment to their bank account via the network, but also provide an inbound reconciliation file that can be automated to post to their GL. So it's just a dramatic reduction in time and expense to receive payment. And then finally, depending on the program design that we might work out with you as a buyer, we have several clients that have offered a preferred vendor status for those vendors that accept virtual card as a form of payment because of the benefits on the security side for both buyer and supplier and the efficiency associated with an electronic form of payment for both buyer and supplier. So in that scenario, we've got clients, buyer clients that will potentially offer increased spend from that supplier if they accepted this as a form of payment. So that we work out typically in a program design exercise. So how does this all come together? How do we take the opportunity that exists in the market, align the tools effectively? Well, we do that through a program design. Now, I'll offer this illustration for educational purposes. I will say that we do enter into programs, or have in the past, where the buyers have said to us, we'd like you to just see if you can bring these suppliers into the program and try and get them converted to card accepting suppliers. And usually, in terms of the overall opportunity for the buyer, that may or may not be an interesting place to start, depending on the suppliers that they've chosen. Do the suppliers accept card today? If they do, what's their negotiated interchange with the network? Will they accept card payments from you based on your volume? There's so many questions that are unanswered when we start there. The illustration attempts to say that when we start clear back at a comprehensive vendor analysis, where we look at the entire vendor file, we identify all vendors that accept. We then take that knowledge of accepting vendors and the associated volume and match it with our buyer customers' objectives for the program. Objectives could be things like maximize efficiency. They could be maximize cash flow through rebate. Depending on those objectives, when we start there and design a program that combines the opportunity identified in the vendor match, that I'll talk about in a moment, with the objectives of our client, we have a far better chance of representing full potential or delivering full potential in terms of cash flow and efficiency that our buyer clients are looking for. So the typical, and I would say this is more historical than now, I think the market is getting smarter, so we don't deal with this as much as we did in the past. But when we start at the very beginning, beginning at the vendor analysis, we can deliver the most optimized results for our clients. So what are the critical components to an optimized integrated payments program? Based on our experience with more than 3,500 of these implementations, frankly, some wildly successful and fully optimized, others at the other end of the spectrum with limited success due to program design flaws. We sort of have learned over the years what does it take to be successful and what are the pitfalls for success. And out of that experience comes the identification of these 8 critical components of architecting dramatic results, as I call this illustration. Regardless of whether it's with CSI or any other provider, these are the elements that are required to deliver program success. If you've had a program in the past that had not been the success you had hoped, it probably has failed in one of these areas. I'm going to point you, just for the sake of time, into 4 critical areas. So of the 8, these are the 4 that have the most influence on program success or mediocrity, or worse yet, failure. Again, starting with vendor analysis, really taking a comprehensive look at all your vendors, understanding who accepts today, what terms they may require in order to accept, when they choose to accept, or when they choose to not accept from one buyer to the next. Why does that happen? So we've got a lot of empirical knowledge at CSI because we've been doing this for so many years. We've got, I think the number recently was up to 900,000 directly accepting vendors for our various buyer programs across multiple vertical sectors. So we have a really good understanding of the profile of accepting vendors. So vendor analysis is where it all starts, and I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like in a moment. Second, and I would say of all, this is probably one of the top 2 most critical elements of success, and that really is program design. Program design, any program without an objective is a program that's destined for less than optimal results. So we really need to know and set some goals together as to what it is that you're trying to achieve from the program. So with the vendor analysis, we'll say, this is your broad-based opportunity. This is the true total potential. How much of that, by when, do we want to go after in terms of actual realization? So we've got to set an objective. Second, we have to understand your negotiation culture. What is your procurement culture or your posture with your vendors? Is it a sense of feeling that it's a customer type relationship, a strategic partner relationship, a very delicate balance of sensitivity in the relationship, or do you have more of a mandate culture, which would mean that you're going to tell your vendors how it's going to be done? So we see the full spectrum of cultures. We see mandate versus negotiate. We see active versus passive relationships. What's yours? And how is it going to influence your ability to achieve the results that we're looking for by working to convert check paid vendors or ACH paid vendors to card vendors? So it's really about those 2 main components of program design and ongoing program management that are critically important. The question that we're answering here is, what will you say if your vendor says no? What's your response? Do we go away, pack up the tent and leave, or do we offer some additional offsetting value? That should all be understood in the beginning. And if you've had a program and it's failed in the past, it's probably failed for that reason. And then finally, over to the top left, talking about vendor enablement, we do, as Chris mentioned, combine efforts with the supplier onboarding team with Enverus, and we compare expertise, we combine expertise, and we put together a vendor outreach, vendor enablement program that will be second to none. In terms of technology and integration, another critical component, ease of integration, file mapping to be able to extract an effective payment file and digest it into the CSI platform is a core competency of ours. We integrate with more than, or accept, I would say, either integrate via pure true API, which is a binary exchange of data, or secure file transfer. We integrate or SFTP with more than 150 ERP systems across the platform, and that grows every day. So we are really good at extracting vendor file, mapping it, and posting it into our solution in a really efficient way. So this is not a heavy lift for implementation. So those are the 8 components, and those last 4 are those that are most critical to consider as you think about this program. So I won't spend a lot of time on this. I know it's a bit of an eye chart, but I just wanted to sort of identify how CSI looks at vendors, why it's so critically important for us to do a vendor match. This is a report that can be very valuable for you as you think about what your opportunity is. So in this example, we looked at somewhere in the neighborhood of 135 or 134 billion dollars a year in spend. We identified how much of that spend CSI currently is paying with other clients. So in this example, there's about $26 billion of that, 26 million in volume that's being paid currently, firsthand knowledge to suppliers on the CSI platform today. And then we go into what we call the match process. So the way the match process works is we ingest your vendor file. We then run it against our known vendor list to identify the 26 million that I just spoke about. We then match your vendor list against Visa's database as well as MasterCard's database of accepting vendors. So not only do we match it against our own internal list of vendors that accept, we also have access as a dual issuer to both of the main networks to see if these vendors might be accepting virtual card payments from someone else. And that is an algorithmic matching process. As you would imagine, companies can be identified and listed in various ERP systems as different names. So ABC Company might be ABC Limited to MasterCard or ABC Enterprises to Visa. So we've got to look at things beyond the name. We look at name, we look at address. If we can get it, we'll look at TIN number or FAIN number. But the match process is inexact. So for that reason, we talk about a low and a high range, or now we call it a base or an upside range. So in this example, in addition to the 26 billion that we have known in terms of suppliers that we currently pay, there's another 7 or 8 million that we think we can pay via card versus based on the analysis we've done with Visa and MasterCard. And the very upside of things, we potentially can get this volume up to 37 million if we consider the higher risk matches, those matches that were not as certain as in the low range opportunity. So just a high level depiction of what we look at. It's a great way for us to estimate value for you based on the amount of spend we can capture by shifting the payment volume to card accepting vendors. So how do we then take that information and make it actionable? Well, we do it through a program design. And this is one illustration that we commonly use in program design. We'll offer some strategies based on experience on how to penetrate deeper into that higher range or that upside of opportunity. So essentially what we've done here is we will have taken the CSI confirmed vendors and their spend, and we will have plotted them into this 9-box that on the vertical axis positions vendors in 9 different phases based on value to you, the customer. So typically volume would be the value driver here. So the higher the volume that we can pay on card, the higher the income opportunity and reduction in processing expense follows along. On the horizontal axis is a plotting of the propensity for the supplier to accept card as a form of payment. So obviously the CSI confirmed recent firsthand knowledge that vendors accept would be posted further to the right in this 9-box analysis. So all of the vendors that accept, in this example, this might be one way to depict for a client. Everything that's in the far right, boxes 1, 2, and 5, would consider to be a mandate approach, meaning, hello, Mr. Vendor, Mr. Supplier, we understand that you accept credit card as a form of payment. From March 1st forward, we'll be paying you via virtual credit card. Please give us a remittance email address for us to send the card payment to along with reconciliation data. That's because we know they accept today. There's no reason why they shouldn't. The rest, though, in boxes 3, 4, 6, and 7, still represent high value to you as the buyer, but have a lower propensity to accept card. These may require some additional value proposition that we have to discuss. So examples of that might be, would you as a buyer on a 60-day net payment term to your supplier be willing to pay 10 days early or 15 days early if it meant driving a 1% rate on return for that cash? And 10 days rate of return at 1% is 3% per month, annualized 36% APR on that use of cash. So we'd like to have that negotiation posture built first before we have the outreach to the supplier, so that we know what our negotiation position is. And we do this together. We design this together. Things that go into consideration here would be, what's your relationship with the vendor? What's your negotiation culture typically? Is it a sole source vendor that we're dealing with, or is it something that we can source elsewhere if the vendor says no? So a lot of discussion would happen on these high value to you suppliers that have a lower propensity to accept. It's a critical exercise, and I'd say this is one or two in terms of the reasons why programs fail. Failure to have this discussion before and have a cogent story before we go out and speak with the supplier about a change in the method of payment. So it's really a fun exercise. We would typically fill in how many vendors and what's the associated spend with each of these boxes, and the boxes are sized based on our ability to reach those vendors and have this discussion. If we can do more, we'll do less phases. If we can do less, we'll do, each box can equal one phase, 1 month in terms of timing. So we've talked a lot here. How do we get started? Well, we can rapidly set things up. The implementation time frame is fairly quick. Once we move through the agreements piece of the process, we're usually a 4-week to 6-week setup period. This is, again, not a heavy lift. It's a matter of a simple extraction of a payment file or leveraging an API that already exists, depending on the ERP. We can process, as Chris mentioned earlier, all payment types, not just virtual card. We've been more focused on virtual card today. We can eliminate these manual check processing and expenses associated. Given today's environment, we can process and approve and release check payments from anywhere on any device, as we are a cloud-based solution. We do not need to be locked to a specific printer or office environment to be able to do that. And we can create a significant opportunity for net new income through the rebate opportunity associated with vendor virtual card payments. So with that, I will turn it back over to the moderators and see if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Eric. We actually do have a few questions here. Let me pull my questions panel out. Okay. First question, is the check run instantly funded for the entire run, or is it only funded when they draw the funds?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that one. The check funding would happen exactly the same way as it does today. The only thing that this team is processing on your behalf is the print and mail feature. We would still associate that print and mail sort of outsourced service to your transaction account that you've got on record. So nothing changes. We do not take possession of funds in advance of payment by a check. So it would happen exactly the same way as it does today.
Next question, do you have any oil and gas users at present?
We are very new to the oil and gas space. So the answer to that question is no to CSI. We do not. That's part of the beauty of this partnership. While we do not have the buy-side expertise of the oil and gas vertical market, we've got a broad-based, comprehensive, no limitation in terms of receiving market on the vendor side. So one of the things that Chris talked a little bit about why he was excited about this partnership, what I'm excited about from CSI's perspective as a commercial leader in the business, is that we are combining this deep knowledge and expertise on the preeminent brand in the oil and gas space with something similar on the vendor side. So no, we don't, but that's why we're so tightly partnered with Enverus. We're super excited about it for that reason.
Perfect. Now, what you just said actually builds to this question. Is CSI an independent company, or is it owned by Enverus?
Good question. CSI is an independent company. This truly is an integrated partnership. It's a business partnership, commercial partnership. It'll be a deep technology partnership shortly as we build out the integrations. But we are a separate and distinct entity. CSI, as mentioned earlier, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Edenred. Edenred is a France-based fintech, publicly listed, traded on the CAC, which is the French equivalent of the New York Stock Exchange, and is about $2 billion per year in revenue. So we are a smaller division within a much larger global fintech.
Perfect, thanks. Is this integrated with OGSys at present?
At present, it is not, but it is in scope for the next phase of the relationship to build the integrations. I don't know if Chris is still on and can speak to that, but that is the plan, at least on the drawing board, and we're moving faster down that path than expected. But as of today, no. Chris, do you want to add anything to that, or can you?
Chris actually had to jump.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, so there, I think you have your answer. As of phase one, no. Thank you, Susie. Sorry.
Sure, no
phase
problem.
two of the relationship will build the integration.
Perfect. And how long is a typical integration period?
Well, I'll separate the question on integration from implementation. So integration, as I said earlier, we typically can give a template that can be used to extract a payment file from virtually any ERP system. So we would provide any of our buyer clients with a list of fields that we would need, and then our internal technology then maps that data to its rightful place within the CSI platform. So the integration from it in its very basic form in terms of a file transfer protocol, as we're talking about, can happen as quickly as you can extract the payment file. So it's really a non-issue. I can tell you CSI has not invested in detailed APIs, nor is it necessary for the 150 ERP platforms we're receiving data from today. It's a very light lift. It can be done in minutes and hours versus days and weeks. Now, on the implementation side, analyzing the vendor match, building the program design with our client, coincidentally managing the file transfer, mapping the files, making sure that everything is being received in the CSI platform as intended from the ERP system on the buyer side. That whole process to go live takes between 4 and 6 weeks. That being said, we do have exceptions. Recently, we brought a very large customer of ours that's processing more than $1 billion per year on virtual card across thousands and thousands of transactions. Their go live period took from start to finish about 2 weeks. But the expectation that we like to set is between 4 to 6 weeks from contract signature to launch to final go live.
Okay. Next question. Do the suppliers have to claim their payments within a certain time frame, and what happens if they don't?
They do typically need to do that because, stemming back to the comment on the virtual card profile, they typically do have an expiration date. So we would, in the program design, be careful to make sure and understand what would be the reasoning, what is the normal behavior that a vendor may have before they take payment. So, if we determine that we need a 30-day expiration time frame because of the vendor's ability to get to the to the process, then that's what we'll do. Or we'll look for ways to make them more efficient on the receiving side so that they don't take as long. But the answer to the question directly is yes, there is an expiration date to the card, and they would need to take and settle payment, authorize and settle payment before the expiration date. But we have flexibility in terms of the expiration date timeframe itself.
Excellent. Here's a great question. So we've talked about payment to suppliers, but is there additional consideration to other payments for royalty owners or working interest owners being considered?
Yes, we are having those conversations today. The initial out-of-the-box first phase of the relationship was really to focus on AP payments, but there are ongoing conversations about the ability to process all forms of payment, excuse me, for Enverus customers to include royalty payments. Those conversations are active and ongoing as we speak.
Perfect. So it looks like CSI has a presence in Florida. Do you guys have a presence elsewhere in the United States?
We do. We have offices in New York. We have offices in Dallas. Today, those are our three main processing hubs. We've got business continuity centers and disaster recovery locations in those two outside of Florida. Excuse me, for obvious reasons. We do get a hurricane once in a while here, so we have to be able to operate from different parts of the country. Our main data center and operational location is here in Bonita Springs, just north of Naples in Southwest Florida, but we do have redundancy centers in Dallas and New York.
Excellent. And I know that our listeners in Houston can definitely relate to the hurricane issue as well. So,
understood, yeah.
Could you speak to the cost of the solution to the audience?
Sure, yes. Well, you'll be interested to know that for the most part, this is a 100% vendor-paid model to the buyer. So all of the costs and fees associated with all forms of payment are typically borne by or borne out of the interchange that's associated with volume that's paid by a virtual card. So again, as part of the vendor analysis, we will identify how much volume can be paid on virtual card, and we'll identify the gross income that'll be generated from that. And then any expenses such as per check processing fees or implementation fees, any kind of nominal fees associated with the program, which are very insignificant, would be borne out of the supplier paying them in the form of interchange. So there is virtually no cost to the buyer for this program. It is a net cash flow positive proposition in the sense that it can reduce processing footprint on the buyer side, but also create income via the interchange and rebate.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? Eric, do we have our contact information on the
Yes, we sure do.
slide deck here? Excellent. Okay. It looks like we have answered everybody's questions, so thank you for sending those in, guys. And if you would like to have a conversation about virtual cards and investigate this a little bit more and automating your accounts payable processes, this is how you can reach us. You can either email us at businessdevelopment@enverus.com, or you can call us at the number listed here on the slide. And other than that, Eric, thank you so much today, and thank you all for attending. And as I mentioned, we will be sending a follow-up email with the replay of the recording, so keep an eye out for your email inbox. But until we meet next time, everybody stay safe and have a great rest of your day.